Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, there's been many a times on my channel where I talked about quote-unquote progressive entertainment as propaganda. But today, I'm going to delve deep into that and show you exactly why it is propaganda. Now, I know many of you probably already agree with that statement, but it's good to go down into the weeds and see, no, this is not just what we see it as. This is the definition of what propaganda is. These stories are meant to propagate an idea in a way that gets around the rational mind, and indeed is set upon a lie. Now, I'm going to use my usual method of talking about this. I'm going to talk about hero, I'm going to talk about story, I'm going to talk about comics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about mythology and legends. And from the discussion of those things, show you exactly why what we see today as quote-unquote progressive entertainment is meant to sell you a lie. And not just sell you a lie, but convince you that a lie is true. It is not entertainment, it is propaganda. So the first thing that I want to point out is how the quote-unquote progressive movement seeks to get rid of reason, and they do so through the destruction of language. And one of their common tactics of the destruction of language is to take a word and to give it the exact opposite meaning of what it actually means. And we can see this with the definition of hero. If you watched my video last week, there is a continuation of the X-Men Green story coming out. You have these people who call themselves X-Men, and they are murderers. They are eco-terrorists and murderers. And yet they call themselves X-Men. And yes, the story is hemming and hawing. Are they really heroes? Are they really not? But I went over the words of the author through an article that I ran across. And the author says, well, they're doing the right thing, just not in the right way. And besides that, I pointed out the fact that Marvel has given this comic the title of X-Men Green, and calling them X-Men is calling them heroes. That's a hero moniker. So yeah, they're saying these murderers and eco-terrorists are heroes. And really, this is the inversion of what a hero is completely. A hero is not a murderer. A hero is not a terrorist. As I'm always saying, the definition, the Western civilization definition of hero for 3,000 years is a paragon of virtue. What we see on the page, especially in comics right now, and on the screen, large and small, is the propagation of the idea that these villainous people are indeed heroes and deserve the moniker of heroes. This is the destruction of that word by giving it the opposite meaning. Now, after I put out that video talking about X-Men Green last week, I was tagged in a conversation from an account called Studio Super. And I'll put the link for their Twitter account in the description if you want to go follow them. I'm doing that because their Twitter account is in Japanese, so you're not going to find it by looking up Studio Super. But anyways, he put out a thread where he talked about how these quote-unquote progressive people, what they want out of people is for them never to look up. That you must either look down or at the very least look at those people around you, but never look up. Never raise your eyes towards the greater glory of what you can become, of ideals, of things like virtue and actual heroism. And I agree completely with that sentiment. And then he posted this panel. The panel is from a 1986 comic called Legends. It was a miniseries where Darkseid tries to destroy the heroes of Earth. And briefly, if you're someone who's not into comics, Darkseid is basically the ultimate dictator. He wants to have ultimate control over the entire universe, over life itself. He's looking for the anti-life equation, and to control the source of everything in existence. But the heroes of Earth have stopped him time and time again. And so his plan within this miniseries is to get rid of those heroes of Earth. And it's summed up in this panel, and I'll read it for those people who don't actually watch the screen. Darkseid, as he's talking about the heroes of Earth, he says, "To some, these puny creatures are legends, the stories of their greatness, inspiring others to greatness as well. Perhaps the time has come to strike at the core of the problem, to destroy the very concept of such legends. Then perhaps humanity will be more compliant. And, just briefly, the way that Darkseid intends to do this, to destroy the notion of hero on the Earth, is to get one of his minions, who looks like a human being, who's a very slick operator, by the way, to go on television and convince people that these heroes are actually evil, to attack their good names in every way possible, and to get the people then to discard them and discard the idea of a hero itself, and thus get rid of those heroes for him. Now, it had not occurred to me before, but this is the perfect example of what the quote-unquote progressives are trying to do. They want to be dictators. They want to be in control of everything, the source of everything. They want to control life itself, even your will and your will to live. And they do so through subversion. They do so by undermining any idea of good, any positive or uplifting idea within the human mind itself. Now, I'm going to go off in what seems like a deep tangent, but this actually does have connection to what I want to tie together within the rest of this video. The miniseries of Legends, as put out by DC Comics in 1986, is very dear to my heart. It is the first comic I ever bought at an actual comic store where I lived. It had just opened, I had just gone into it, it was the first book I bought. Now, I had gone to other comic stores in other places when I went on trips and things like that, but this was the first comic shop ever to exist where I lived. And so it does hold a special place in my heart. And not only that, but the John Byrne art is spectacular. This is where the man is at his peak. The only one I think could even compare or outstrip him at this time would be George Perez. That's partly why I'm showing you the Legends art in the background. But I'm one of those people who enjoys extremely detailed and clean art, which you can probably tell if you've read my book, Thomas Valiant. My artist, Renzo Rodriguez, fit that to a T. But anyways, my point being is that when I think about comics, it is, to some extent, a reference for my life. I am a comic fan. I have been so since as long as I can remember. And to me, especially because I talked about this before, I have a very weird memory where I can remember things as if they were yesterday. I remember picking up this comic in 1986. I remember it exactly. And for me, with my memory, it's hard to keep track of things time-wise when you can think about stuff that happened in 1986 as if it was yesterday. And so I use comics to actually orient myself in time. I think about what was I reading for a comic at that time, and I remember it, and then I can look up that comic and see, oh, that happened in 1986. Quite literally, I do this all the time. I can remember the first time I went to this specific apple orchard with my family because I was reading Armor Wars from Iron Man. I can remember that awful day when I had to go to the dentist and get my molars out because I was reading Conan the King, where Conan's son dies. I can remember specifically that summer that I spent almost the entire summer vacation in our local town, in my local dojo, training as much as I could. And I can pinpoint it in time because after I did that, I would go down to the local 7-Eleven knockoff and see if they had the latest copy of Cyber-Rad. So honestly, I orient myself in history through what I was reading, what comic books I was reading at the time. I'll stop there, but put a pin in that thought and save it for later, because I'm going to come back to that. But let's go back and talk about the idea of legends, the idea of heroes. Now, honestly, I'm going to talk more about myths than legends, and those two are very specific things. Legends would be more specific events that happen in history being handed down from one person to another, and that's where those stories emerge from. But myth is more tied to a fundamental idea of understanding what is around you and how the people of that time tried to understand forces that were bigger than them. And DC Comics, with Superman, Batman, Flash, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, DC Comics is seen by many as taking those old mythological figures and just bringing them forward in the ideas of superheroes. That's what Flash is. That's why he has those silly wings on the side of his head. Why? Because the ancient god Mercury had a helmet which had wings on it, which the original Flash actually had the same kind of helmet. And so you see how these heroes, especially within the DC universe, are a copy to some extent of ancient myth. Now, to tie some of these loose ends together, I want to give you a quote from an author. Who was it? I think it was Albert Cadmus. He said, "Fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth." Now, I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but to me, that statement itself is talking about how stories have been constructed within Western civilization, and really, I would say within all of human civilization. We'll just focus on Western civilization for a minimum of 2,400 years. I could even go back 3,000 years. Why? Because if we look at Aristotle and what Aristotle said stories were back 2,400 years ago, and him describing stories that were 800 years older than him, he talked about story as being a representation of reality and at the same time being a rational rhetorical argument. Now, here's the thing. Looking at that quote, that fiction is the lie through which we tell a truth, this, I think, is exactly what Aristotle was saying in his own way. Why? Because, again, he says it needs to be a representation of reality. This representation of reality, it's not reality itself. We need to engage our suspension of disbelief to look at it as if it was reality, to look at those words on a page or that screen or the people on that stage and say, yeah, I'm going to tell my mind just for a moment that this is real, but I know it's not real. That's the lie. It's a representation of reality as much as possible, but not reality itself. But we convince ourselves that it is in that moment. But at the same time, he says it is a rational rhetorical argument. Now, you can have a rhetorical argument that's not rational. You can be a sophist and use rhetoric in a way to deceive people. But no, he talks about a rational rhetorical argument. And how do we know that? Because when talking about a rhetorical argument and couching it in the terms of a reflection of reality, if you take argumentation and you cross it with reality, then your argumentation becomes rational, because reason itself is built upon the principles of reality. This is what Aristotle says in I think it's Metaphysics 1, where he talks about how rationality is how we understand things through universals, through principles. Those universals and principles are the underlying rules of reality. So again, if you take a rational argument and you cross it with a representation of reality, you're looking at a rational argument, and in this case, it's a rational rhetorical argument. So he's talking about the truth. These universals, these principles, they're the broad strokes of reality. They're the broad strokes of the truth. And therefore, when you tell a story, you're telling a truth through a lie. But I want to take just one step backwards from that to go even deeper into this before we go forward. All of that I just applied to Aristotle and what he talks about when he's discussing story is only true to some extent. Because if you listen to Aristotle and his talking about story, he's talking about things like Hesiod and Homer, all of those stories that he grew up with. And the thing being that for the Greeks, even the Greeks of his time, those were considered inspired text. They were considered part of religion. If you've ever read Hesiod or Homer or any of those older sources, you know that over and over again, the author says things like, "O Muse, inspire me to tell this story." They're asking for spiritus, the divine breath, inspiration, so that they can be inspired to tell these events as they actually unfolded. So they believed these things to be inspired text. In a different way, I would say, than something like the Bible, but it's the same fundamental principle. If you look at the Bible, that's what believing Christians actually think. That this is words that were inspired by God. That the authors, yes, they were human, but God inspired them, gave them part of his divine breath to get them to explain to the others as a conduit to explain what was true, not only in a universal sense, but in a historical sense and a universal sense all at the same time. These were inspired texts. And in this sense, inspired text, if the people saw them as being inspired text, they were not seen as a truth told through a lie. They were seen as a truth told through a truth. because the author, being inspired by these greater forces of the universe, which was directing them to say very specific things, was in many instances having them talk about what actually historically happened as an example of the greater universals and principles that govern reality itself. But by the time of Aristotle, he's also talking about the great playwrights and the great storytellers of his time, and how they're using those older texts to build their own stories. So he is, in some sense, moving on from that old idea of a truth told through a truth to a truth told through a lie. He's talking about storytelling where it wasn't necessarily true that the storyteller was inspired, but those storytellers were depending on those old inspired texts. If you look at the great playwrights of Greece, if you look at Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides, you'll see that they're always quoting these old myths. If you don't know anything about those myths, it's very hard to understand what they're actually trying to say. And the same thing really is true for the greatest playwright in Western civilization. That would be Shakespeare. He not only took those old myths from Greece and Rome, but he also put in a healthy dose of the Bible and those inspired texts as well. And I would say 100% that if you don't know anything about the Bible, or you don't know anything about myths and legends of ancient Greece and Rome, then when you read Shakespeare, you're really not getting the whole picture. Why? Because these people, they were depending upon those old stories, those old myths, those old legends, those old inspired texts, if they saw them that way, as being the broad strokes of reality, of universals and principles, because they knew they were making up a story, they knew they were using fiction, and therefore they still wanted to tell this truth through the fiction, through the lie that they were using as their stories for their plays. And why is this all important? What does this have to do with propaganda and your quote-unquote progressive storytelling? Well, if you listened to my video last week when I went over one of the people who works for Disney, works for Marvel Entertainment, is a VP in one of their wings of television, she was talking about a certain comic that came out from Marvel Comics just this year. She was talking about how it had queer representation in it, and she was talking about how this would cement in history the place of this particular part of the progressive movement. So she was talking about it as if it was a guidepost, so to speak, for those people in the future to look back at history and say, this is a turning point of change. And also, within that article, she's talking about herself as a conduit. She's talking about herself in terms, if you look at them in the way that they have been historically used, as if she was the conduit for some inspired text that was generated from these people who believe and live out the progressive lifestyle that she was talking about. And if you think that's a bit of a stretch, I'll just reference you back to an old video that I did. It was one of the very first that I did on my channel. I'll link it in the description, so please be patient with it. It is of very poor quality. I was still trying to learn how to make videos at that time. But it was a video, the first one I did about Sana Amanat, the Vice President of Content and Character Development at Marvel Comics at that time. She was specifically talking to her interviewers about how comic books and comic book stories were the new mythology in this modern age. And not only that, of how to use them in a psychological way, and these are her words, to push positive ideas. Now, in her mind, as she goes on and talks about in the rest of this interview, positive ideas means progressive ideas. So, she's talking about comic books and superheroes as the new mythology. That new mythology is the basis of understanding and teaching what? Progressivism, of course. So let's follow this through historically. Originally, you had texts that were seen as being inspired, and so they would be telling a truth through a truth. And these inspired texts, whether they were Homer and Hesiod for the Greeks or the Bible for Christians, they were believed to be the be-all and end-all of where you got your answers from. Why? Because this is the universe itself, or God himself, or the pantheon of gods themselves, specifically telling people and instructing them, this is how things are. This is a truth told through a truth. And even if you don't believe that, you can't look at all of the scholarship that came out of the classical and medieval periods and say that this was not, at the very least, a useful mechanism to use in order to understand the universals and principles that govern reality. And quite honestly, this was the basis of the original way of teaching people how to think. This was the original basis of universities. The bedrock of all that needed to be taught within those medieval universities was, it stops when you get back to inspired text. That's the truth. Now, when the predecessors, the precursors of these quote-unquote progressive people took over these institutions, they got rid of that idea. They said, we can't use this anymore. We can't use these texts as if they were infallible, as if they were telling a truth through a truth. But they needed something as a bedrock. And what did they move back to? Well, they moved back to those old Greek and Roman myths and legends and philosophy. This became the basis of what is known as a Western liberal arts education. And you can't have a university unless you have an arts program, by the way. So it is the core of the university system. And trust me, I went through university. I have a degree in classics, in history, in philosophy, in political theory. I was steeped in a liberal arts education. Luckily, I had something to balance that out. But the point was that at that time, when they overthrew the idea of divinely inspired text, telling a truth through a truth, they moved back to those old texts and they said, well, they were sort of inspired, but really it was just them trying to understand how the universe worked. And so they saw those texts at that time as a truth told through a lie. But we get to the last 50 years, really specifically the last 20 years, where you have this quote-unquote progressive movement, and they're saying, oh, you can't teach things like Shakespeare anymore. You can't teach things like ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and history. You can't do that anymore. That's a kind of supremacy of European culture. You need to get away from that in a liberal arts education. You need to abandon that. And abandon it for what? Replace it with what? Well, you replace it with the myths that have been generated through quote-unquote progressivism. This is why you get these gender studies and feminist studies and all these other kinds of university programs trying to literally, as I covered in one of my videos, talking about infecting every other department in the university system so that they go back to their departments and their way of thinking as the bedrock and system by which everything is governed. And by the way, when I reference these things as a virus that infects other disciplines, these are not my words. These are the specific words that they use in feminist scholarship. But the real point is that even calling these things myths is giving them too much credit. Why? Because even if we look at those old texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans and say, yeah, they were just trying to understand reality that was around them, and this was the best that they could come up with. They were still trying to understand those universals and principles that govern all of reality. That is to say, they were still trying to use reason. But your quote-unquote progressive people have abandoned reason. And here's when I usually say, just like that Smithsonian article that called reason and logical thinking part of a supremacist movement. But since I'm here and talking about this specific thing, I'm going to back that one up right now. Because the entire idea of progressivism is that we can progressively make society better and better and better. And it is a utopian-minded ideal. Now, I usually get someone in the comments saying, oh, I don't want utopia, I just want a better society. Yeah, if you think that you can make society constantly better, that is a utopian-minded ideal. And the point being is that this utopian-minded ideal is not rational. Why? Well, because this utopian-minded ideal is based upon the idea that universals and principles don't exist. And if reason is understanding through universals and principles, and they don't exist, therefore you can't have reason. And these universals and principles can't exist in their way of thinking, because if they did, they would have to revolve themselves around those universals and principles in order to create the utopian society that they wish to progress themselves towards. But the way that this ideology works is through power politics. They believe that this can be brought about socially through exercising power. That's it. That's all they need. Power. Once they have enough power, they can change anything. If you can change anything, that means you can change universals and principles. If you can change universals and principles, they don't actually exist because they're unchangeable things. Therefore, if you believe that you can change anything, you don't believe in universals and principles. And I say all that because, of course, if they're not being rational, they're not actually being truthful. Why? Because rational, as I said again, is based upon the principles of reality, the principles of existence. If you're not following the principles of reality and existence, if you're basing something, anything, on ideas that are not based in reality, then you're telling a lie. So what are they doing with their stories? Well, what they're doing with their stories is that they're creating this new quote-unquote mythology by telling a lie through a lie. Whereas mankind used story originally to try and tell a truth through a truth, and then it moved on to trying to tell a truth through a lie. Now we've gotten to that point where they can move it even further to now they're telling a lie through a lie. They don't believe it's a lie because they don't believe in any truth. They don't believe in any fixed truth at all. If they did, that would be a principle and universal that they would have to work around, and their power politics would not actually be possible. And where there's no truth, there's no lie, there's just what is. There's just what their power allows them to do. But for anybody who believes that there are principles and universals to reality, anybody who believes there is truth in the universe, in existence, you're looking at what they're doing and saying, no, they're trying to tell a lie through a lie. And story, again, is the system by which they are doing this. Because we have been so ingrained, honestly, I would say, because of the nature of human beings and how we learn, it is not something taught, it is part of our nature, that we are looking at and striving for greater truths when we tell a story, whether it be a truth through a truth or a truth through a lie. We're still looking in the fundamental background for that truth that is being expressed there. And so they're telling a story going, oh, people are still going to do that. They're just going to accept what we say, which is our quote-unquote progressive principle, as if it were the truth, although we know that it's not. And of course, they know that it's not because they know they're going to change it sometime in the future. They're going to say, well, that was the truth then, but this is the truth now. We have the power and we're going to redeclare it as the truth. It doesn't matter if it 100% contradicts what we said was the truth before. This is the truth now. And this is where I bring back into this discussion what I talked about at the first, when I was talking about me orienting myself through history, through the comics that I read and when they came out. That's what they want as the fundamental orientation mechanism of everyone in society. And of course, you have to abandon all of those great stories of the past, abandon Shakespeare because he was using older stories to delve into texts that were trying to teach a truth through a truth. You have to abandon those older stories of Hesiod, Homer, even Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, anybody that is in the European past. Why? Because they were doing the same thing, trying to teach a truth through a truth, trying to teach a truth through a lie. They were still trying to look at those universals and principles. We got to get rid of all of that, all of those old kinds of storytelling, and replace it only with our type of storytelling, and it be the basis for how people actually think. And before you say that I'm just talking out my hat, just look at the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, all of these quote-unquote progressive people online, what would they do? They would constantly quote Buffy the Vampire Slayer as if it was the inspired text of God, and just use that as the basis of understanding all of their existence. But when Joss Whedon fell out of favor with the progressive crowd, then they moved on to Harry Potter, and Harry Potter became their Bible. And again, they would quote it as if it was inspired text. Everything would go back to those stories. Everything in their lives would be referenced back to those stories. And that was how they oriented themselves and how they lived their lives. And again, then J.K. Rowling fell out of favor with the progressive crowd. What do they have now? They have Marvel stories and Marvel movies. I watch some of these videos from people who are on the quote-unquote progressive side, and they say things to each other like, what's your favorite line in all of the Marvel movies? And I'm thinking to myself, how in the world can you pick out one single line from 20 to 30 movies and shows at the very least right now and say, this is my favorite line? But no, these guys can do it without even blinking. Why? Well, again, of course, because This has become their new Bible. This has become their new form of understanding everything in the universe, of understanding everything around them. It's through these stories, these quote-unquote progressive stories. And as I said, it's all based upon a lie. It's all propaganda. It's all trying to teach you something, not universals, not principles, but something in a way that gets around your rational mind. And it has to get around your rational mind, because if you're rational, you're thinking about universals and principles. No, you just have to obey what they say as being true, as if it were true. And again, even if it's contradictory to what you see around you, to what you experience within your own life, to what they said 5 minutes ago. If they tell you there's 5 lights, there's 5 lights. It doesn't matter if you see 4 lights. And again, I'm not being hyperbolic. Go back to that video. Listen to the original interview with Sana Amanat, where she talks about superhero stories being the new mythology, where they have to be used in a psychological way to push positive, progressive ideas. And what is being presented to you over and over again, as if it were a story, is nothing more than an extension of power politics meant to change your psychological makeup by teaching you to look at the lie of progressivism as if it were the truth, no matter how many times it changes. To beat out of you the inclination to look up to higher things like reason and virtue and heroism, in order to ensure that you, as part of humanity, become more compliant. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.